Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to our 97th Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our discussion panels twice monthly to demonstrate the value of civil, productive, open-minded political discussion. Today our panel will discuss American compassion and examine its impact on our culture, both positive and negative. Today's panel, beginning on my left, is Patty Haskins, retired math teacher and member of the Wadsworth City Council. On her left is Jerry Ritzman, co-founder of Ritzman Pharmacies, and now enjoying his first week of retirement. On his left is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, returning to us after several weeks of a hip replacement. Excuse me. Ron is a retired senior research chemist. And finally, on his left is Bryan Laubaugh, president of R&B Financial Services. Patty, a frequent subject in political debates is, are we doing the right things when it comes to fighting poverty? Or are we making matters worse? What do you think?
Well, I first think that we have a duty to take care of those that are less fortunate than us. There's a famous quote, and I've seen it actually accredited to a number of people, which basically says that the measure of a society is how we treat the least fortunate amongst us. And I think that's true, that we have to care about the condition of the homeless. We have to care about the children that are living in abusive situations, that don't have food on the table, that can't get breakfast, that can't get lunch. We have to care about refugees that are trapped in foreign countries where their life is at risk every day and they do not know the meaning of the word safe. We have to be concerned about children that are starving in various nations or women that are being violated in various nations. And I think that we need to do whatever we can in order to help them. Now that takes a lot of different faces when you look at how you take care of them. Throwing money at problems doesn't always make it go away. And just providing money to people is not the only thing that we need to do. We need to provide charitable outreach, whether it be by supporting missionaries or UN groups that will go in and assist those in other countries that need help. It may require that here in the United States that we provide community dinners for those that do not have food to put on the table. We actually do that in town in coordination with the Salvation Army and many groups. It may mean that we help build a home for a family, like with Habitat for Humanity. It may mean that we need to raise the minimum wage so that people can actually work a job 40 hours a week that will at least enable them to put food on the table and provide the basic needs for a family. Our churches do a great deal of work in providing help for others, but more is needed because they can't do it alone. Now, does that mean that I have to give money or all of my money or the greatest share of my money to those less fortunate than myself? Not necessarily. If we do not have the money to give, you can provide manpower, you can assist, and I don't mean quitting your job and doing this full time, but whether it just be simply serving that meal on a Friday evening to those in town that need it, or whether it means helping out at the Habitat for Humanity position. Those are the things that we can do to help the poor, and I think that there is a moral obligation that we have to do so.
Jerry, what are your thoughts?
Well, I've had several thoughts on this, and over the last month or so, I came in contact with a book called Toxic Charity. Those two words don't seem to go together real well, but it was interesting, some of the concepts that were in that book. In the book, they talk about that a lot of the charity that we do now goes beyond what the author feels it should. He feels that there should be charity and there should be helping folks out in the event of a disaster or a crisis, whether it be an individual, a family, a community, or a country. But then once the crisis is over, that support, in his opinion, should stop. And I'll refer to my e-book here. And the author says he was observing some of the reactions that he observed in Atlanta, where he was doing some charitable work. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it was through can't remember if it was through a church or another organization. He says, about that time I happened across the devastating words written by Jacques Ellul, a French philosopher and lay theologian. And he said, it's important that giving be truly free. It must never degenerate into charity in the pejorative sense. Almsgiving is Mammon's perversion of giving. It affirms the superiority of the giver, who thus gains a point on the recipient, binds him, demands gratitude, humiliates him, and reduces him to a lower state than he had before. He talks about when he distributed some Christmas gifts to a family and how the male of the family during the time of the distribution disappeared because it made him feel like he was not able to give his family what was expected of them. And he said he also observed during food distributions and so forth, he said that he saw too often how quickly the recipient's response to charity devolved from gratitude to expectation to entitlement. And so once it his point is that once it goes beyond the point of disaster or crisis relief, how then that makes the recipients become dependent upon it. And I'll just give you kind of an allegory or a story that might underline what this meant. I know of a situation where a group of individuals rented a boat to take a boat and do a little tour around an island. Upon leaving the dock, the folks who rented the boat said, now be sure you do not feed the dolphins, because if you feed the dolphins and you're caught, you'll get a $10,000 fine, because the EPA or whomever the agency is that made this rule says we do not want people to feed the dolphins, because after a while they'll become dependent upon the handouts from people in the boats, and they will lose the ability to fend for themselves. One of the individuals on the boat trip said, boy, isn't that interesting that one branch of the federal government can figure that out about dolphins, but they can't another branch can't figure that out about people. And so the movement now in relief, charity, whether it be within our country or in other countries, other what we consider emerging economies, the movement now is to try and help people become self-sufficient. And so I think I know we're living in a bubble here in Wadsworth, Ohio, and I know I am. It just seems that devolving from gratitude to expectation to entitlement is what can happen if we continue to give charity unrestrained after the crisis is met. And one other thing, I talked to a guy who knew about a lot of the church mission trips that go to the Central America, Haiti, and that type of thing. And he said he knew of one group that sent a number of people down there on different occasions throughout the summer season, okay? He said they were looking for things for them to do. He says they ended up painting a schoolroom like 4 or 5 times, the same schoolroom, different groups, because they were looking for things for them to do. They talked about people cleaning up areas where the residents of the community were just sitting around watching them. So I don't know if that's the
It certainly
solution
is.
to it or
It's
not.
a tough call, isn't it?
It is. So I don't know who's benefiting from those trips in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Well, Ron, it's been a long time since we've heard your opinion about anything.
Well, pretty interesting, Jerry. You're talking about an idea of balance here, and I think that's important to keep in mind. Compassion is in biologically it's within us. It's part of our nature. I mean, I'm thinking of things like in nature, like the meerkats in South Africa or the prairie dogs in the United States. These groups live in colonies, and they post a sentinel. And the sentinel, if he sees a hawk coming or a snake or a coyote, gives an alarm whistle. That makes him vulnerable because they can zero in on the sentinel. But he does it altruistically so that the colony can survive. People do the same thing. Any parent knows that you put the livelihood of your children above yourself in so many occasions. If you don't, people don't like that very well. Politically, we knee-jerk liberals here, I think we tend to perceive Republicans as being rather mean-spirited in this respect. But I think comes to foreign aid, comes to aid for the dependent children, comes to school lunches, they start cutting funds for this. Why do we do that? And I think, I've also often thought, you have to sell that in terms of enlightened self-interest. You help out in the AIDS crisis or the Ebola or the Zika in Sudan. Sudan now is in a state of famine. Donate to that. Does that give us anything? Yes, it does. It gives us credibility in the national scene. It gives us a leg up, if you will, with that particular government. They tend more to become our friends. School lunches. Help a kid. I read a little post the other day about a fellow that said, I was one of these hungry kids. I realize now that my parents really couldn't afford to give me breakfast or give me lunch. I didn't think about, is this going to help my grades? Does this help me study better? I was a hungry kid and I ate. Well, that's one thing. We have to think that, okay, let's give a kid a breakfast. That kid can apply himself better in school. That kid is more easily become a contributing member of society if he gets a good education. Do we have to promote this to our Republican and our Democratic friends as a means of enlightened self-interest, to express our compassion, express our giving nature because of what we get out of it? Yeah, I think so. That's part of our nature too. We want to get something out of it.
Yep. Brian, you got this sneaky smile on your face.
I'm just glad that Ron is back. You know, I was worried. You know, he went through his hip. I had both of my hips replaced, and I was just worried for him. It's good to have him back. You know, I'm glad he didn't throw me all the way under the bus as far as how Republicans feel about things. But I think my view would be that if we get the federal government out of this and send the money directly to the local organizations, whether it be a religious organization, whether it be a Habitat for Humanity or a Salvation Army, some organization that has a local presence, because it goes back to my feeling is the farther you send your money away, the less control you have on it. So when the money comes back into a school lunch program, the federal government puts all these requirements on it. You know, you got to have broccoli, you got to have carrots, you got to do this, you got to do that.
And ketchup is not a food.
And you can't have ketchup, you can't have fries. And so 90% of the meal gets pitched. You know, the kids don't eat it.
Yeah.
So you know, I think as a country, I would say that we're probably one of the most compassionate countries, by and large. I don't think there's any other country, if you do your Google search and everything, I don't think there's any other country that gives as much aid as we do as a country to all the problems that crop up in the world. I think we are probably the world's social worker when it comes to that. But I would agree from the standpoint of what Jerry says is that you can love a person to death. And I think that's what we're really doing with some of the folks that are out there. We've created a system that is not encouraging people to actually find work. We're creating a system. The unintended consequence of raising the minimum wage is that businesses aren't required to hire people. So McDonald's and Burger King and all the places where people get a start decide, I can take 5 or 6 people off my head count. I'll just put in a kiosk. So where does that give that person that needs that opportunity to hone their skills for work, when the employer's not going to hire them at $15 an hour? And that's just the way it is. So it needs to be sort of a multifaceted approach. There needs to be a component of work in there. There needs to be a component of some family services, because there's a lot of dysfunction in families that are poor. There needs to be a component of giving back. We've helped a little bit on some Habitat homes. The people that are receiving those homes have sweat equity in that. And I think that's the perfect model for charity. If you're going to get it, then you should be able to volunteer to provide some sweat equity, whether it's working the soup line. There should be a method to instill pride in people, because I agree, when people are receiving that particular handout, if you will, instead of a hand up, it's a handout. The father leaves the home. I mean, and you can almost point to any study, and in those particular situations, there's not a father in the home. So it has to be a little broader in terms of just saying, okay, we're compassionate. Here's your food for the week, or here's here's your check, or here's your credit card where you go in and you buy things. It needs to be attacked in a variety of ways, and I think we can do it. I don't think it's out of our grasp. It's just that we have to step back and say, okay, how do we do it better? And I think there's a lot of room to do that. Nobody wants that little boy to starve at school. Nobody wants the family to go without. But when you look at the level of our poverty in our country, the folks that live in our country that are considered poor are wealthy compared to other countries. They're poor people.
Well,
okay?
even they're middle class.
Exactly, even some of their middle class. So there's a lot of ways to go about it. I like everything that I've heard here. I agree 100% that we need to practice a compassionate, loving way to handle this, but we can't just ignore some of the issues that have cropped up with the current system.
Yeah, there was a meeting in Austin, Texas, on the 25th anniversary of the signing of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. And I know that Sergeant Shriver and a bunch of people who were involved in administering the program had a celebratory evening, drinking to the success of the War on Poverty, and pretty much announced the poverty in the United States is over. And one way of looking at poverty, and the way they were looking at it, is the fundamental basic needs of Americans have been met. There's no reason for anyone now to be hungry or without a home, without clothing, and all of that. They defined poverty that way. What they missed, though, was the unintended consequences, what you're talking about, the dependency that was developed, and the idea that I don't need to work ever again. That's a tragedy, but the big problem is, how do you separate the two? How do you teach a man to fish when he's starving and you've got a basket full of fish?
The question kind of arises: is this a moral failing of the program or of the recipient?
I have an idea. I would say the program, but I can't blame them. Yes, people are going to respond to incentives. Human beings have always done that. And if the incentive is to stay out of work and receive a check from the government, they're going to do it. And in the next generation and the generation after that, you wind up with children who have never known anyone who had a job.
Yet you see lots of anecdotes of people particularly single moms who can't get a job and give that up because they don't make enough in the job they can get in order to afford the services that the government is paying for, child care and what have you. That's,
I read something where, on the average, though, the job that would be available to a welfare mother would give them an equivalent of 15 cents an hour more than what they're making on welfare. And that's hardly worth it.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, you know, you read about what you mentioned, John, about folks that maybe have not known anybody in their immediate or close to immediate family that ever held a job, you know, for a couple or three generations, have never worked. We didn't get here overnight. And it's not going to get solved overnight.
No.
But it's going to take about as many generations to get out of it as that it's taken to get where we are now, I believe. But I don't know if the movement's even started in that direction. In some circles, it has.
How would you even begin?
I don't know.
You know, one of the things you mentioned about you only make 15 cents more working on the job. You know, Bryan, you talked about like the McDonald's job. And I mentioned before that the average McDonald's worker is not a high school kid. They are adults. That is their job. And they cannot make enough money to support their family by working that job. And you find many of them are working at 3 different places and still can barely make ends meet. You know, that's why I think we need the increase of the minimum wage and the threat that McDonald's will go out, you know, that's, I think, a failing on their part from a moral standpoint. And I know they have an obligation to their stockholders.
That's true too. And
I think that's more of a failing of our ability as a society to train people to move up in their work capacities. I never looked at a job, you know, I started out working at a loading dock at a trucking company. I don't know how much I made. I was in 11th grade, you know, getting a job so that I could pay for gas to put in my dad's car so I could use it on a date. I never looked at that job as the job that I wanted for the rest of my life. And so I used that as a springboard. So we have to be able to say, hey, okay, you're working here, but let's get you some training so that you don't have to work the French fryer the rest of your life. And you don't have to work the grill the rest of your life. Now, if you want to be a short order cook or a chef, that's a track that you can take. But we don't do that. We just say, okay, you got the job, you're making X. I'm not saying it's adequate. It's probably not adequate to support a family, but I don't believe that's what those entry-level jobs were ever meant to be, was to raise a family on.
I'm going to take a guess, Bryan, that in the culture that you grew up in, upward mobility was expected.
Work was expected.
You're from a military family.
Yeah,
aren't you? Yes.
work was not well, sometimes it was a 4-letter word, but you were expected to, you know, if there were certain things you wanted over and above what my parents could provide, you worked for that. It wasn't like, oh, we don't want you to work, you know. You went out and took a part-time job somewhere. You mowed some grass. Yeah, I mean, I would think if we went down the line here, everybody here had some sort of a interim job.
I was a caddy at the Gulfport when I was 12 years old.
Yeah, you went out and you caddied. You know, maybe you mowed some grass. Maybe it was a job. You put some extra money in your pocket. But that's not happening now. You know, that's not happening amongst the poor now. It's beneath them. You know, I go back. You know, when my dad retired from the Army, he got a job as a janitor. He got a job before the job for the post office came up. You know, he supported his family. It wasn't like he was going to sit there and collect his pension, because it wasn't enough to provide for his family. He got a job as a janitor. He drove a little truck and delivered candy. It wasn't beneath him. He was not so prideful that he was going to sit back and do nothing. And I think that has entered into the equation, is we're so worried about people's pride to actually work. You know, to work. What's wrong with that?
I had a friend who was a general surgeon, and when he retired, he was only retired for a short period of time when he decided he couldn't stand this. So he went to work for a florist delivering flowers. He was a surgeon, and there was a place that he delivered flowers. And the woman looked at him and said, I think I know you. He said, yeah, I took out your gallbladder. But I think that the tough thing is, Jerry pointed out, where do you begin to make a turnaround? How do you not feed a starving child? Forget how they got to be starving.
Yeah.
I mean, so the parents took all their resources and spent it on tattoos and drugs. That wasn't the child's fault. You just can't leave the kid.
Mm-hmm.
That's a crisis situation,
Yeah.
so you take care of it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we need to have a concentrated effort by some really smart people, good philosophers, like Plato said, democracy will only work when philosophers become politicians, or if by some miracle politicians become philosophers. And that it's going to take a non-political approach, but we are so politicized now,
Right.
that you could come up with the most ingenious solution, and what the other party is going to try to block
If you don't have the right
out.
letter next to your name, yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and that is tremendous difficulty. There are a number of references in the Bible to what we're supposed to do about poverty. And Jesus said, if you want to be perfect, go and sell what you own and give the money to the destitute, and you will have a treasure in heaven. Then come back and follow me. That's not what anyone is expecting of anyone else.
I heard a preacher once say, "Oh, consider the birds in the air and the lilies in the field. They take care." So that's okay for if you're a bird or a flower, but people got to go out and work for it.
I guess it's too late to venture off into another topic here. But our quote, and I selected this quote in honor of Ron Chamberlin, who was returned to us after recuperating. His favorite philosopher, the Dalai Lama, said, use your voice for kindness, your ears for compassion, your hands for charity, your mind for truth, and your heart for love. Thank you, Ron, and the Dalai.
My man, the Dalai Lama.